How the Nazi regime regulated even private life. Good evening, dear friends. War is often remembered through maps, offensives, and the names of generals. But beneath every campaign lies a quieter reality, one that rarely appears in official histories and is even less comfortable to confront. As Nazi Germany expanded across Europe, it did not only seize land and resources, it sought to regulate every aspect of human behavior, including the most private parts of life. Control, in this system, was not limited to laws or borders. It extended into bodies, routines, and silence. Tonight's story explores one of the least discussed mechanisms of that control. Not as spectacle, not as shock, but as policy. A system built to manage obedience, suppress resistance, and enforce hierarchy, carried out behind closed doors, justified through bureaucracy, and remembered mostly through fragments. This is not a story of consent or choice. It is a story of power, coercion, and how totalitarian systems weaponize vulnerability in ways that leave scars long after the war ends. As Nazi Germany expanded across Europe, its leadership understood that conquest was not only territorial. Occupation required discipline, predictability, and control over millions of soldiers and prisoners. Within this logic, personal behavior became a matter of state concern. The regime did not limit itself to laws and borders. It sought to regulate private life itself. Nazi ideology classified intimacy according to hierarchy and usefulness. Certain relationships were framed as acceptable, others as dangerous or destabilizing. The purpose was not morality, but order. By defining what was permitted and under what conditions, the state aimed to reduce what it considered disorder while reinforcing racial and social boundaries. To implement this vision, the regime established tightly regulated facilities under military and SS supervision. On paper, these institutions were presented as pragmatic administrative solutions, governed by schedules, rules, and oversight. In reality, they functioned as instruments of domination, built on coercion rather than choice. Women were drawn into this system through force, deception, or exploitation of vulnerability. Many were taken from occupied territories. Others were transferred from prisons or camps. None entered freely, and none retained control over their fate once inside. Their lives were reduced to routine, surveillance, and compliance. Conditions were harsh and deliberately dehumanizing. Living quarters were overcrowded and stripped of privacy. Nutrition was minimal, calculated only to maintain basic physical capacity. Medical attention existed solely to preserve usefulness, not well-being. Individual identity disappeared, replaced by classification and regulation. People became interchangeable units within a system designed to extract obedience. The regime justified this structure through bureaucratic language. Officials claimed it was necessary for discipline, prevention, and efficiency. By framing exploitation as administration, the system normalized abuse without ever naming it as such. Harm was broken into procedures, schedules, and reports, allowing responsibility to dissolve into paperwork. In occupied Western Europe, the situation became even more complex. Cities with long histories of regulated vice were placed under military authority. Some civilians, driven by collapse and survival pressure, were pushed into these spaces under extreme imbalance of power. Others were taken outright. Choice, where it appeared to exist, was shaped by fear and scarcity. When occupation ended, suffering did not. Many women associated with these systems were publicly punished rather than protected. They were accused of collaboration, shamed, and ostracized. Context vanished. Coercion was ignored. The end of the war brought judgment, not relief. Victims were recast as offenders, and silence followed. Within concentration camps, the system reached its most calculated form. Selected women were transferred from other camps into facilities controlled entirely by guards. These institutions were designed to manipulate behavior rather than provide relief. Access was granted as a reward, creating new hierarchies among prisoners. This policy served multiple purposes. It encouraged compliance, fractured solidarity, and fostered resentment among inmates. Survival became competitive. Cooperation gave way to suspicion. By introducing selective privilege, the regime undermined any remaining sense of collective resistance. The women forced into these roles were promised better conditions or eventual release. These promises were almost never fulfilled. When their perceived usefulness declined, many were returned to harsher environments. The system extracted compliance, then discarded it. The psychological impact extended far beyond physical hardship. These women were isolated, stigmatized, and blamed for circumstances entirely beyond their control. After the war, recognition as victims was slow and often incomplete. Many received no compensation and no official acknowledgement. Their suffering remained invisible within broader narratives of atrocity. One of the most unusual extensions of this policy appeared in Berlin, where an exclusive establishment was repurposed for intelligence gathering. High-ranking officials and foreign visitors were observed in private settings, with conversations monitored for political leverage. What appeared outwardly as indulgence was, in fact, surveillance. Over time, myths and sensational stories grew around such places. Later films and popular accounts often distorted reality, replacing coercion with fantasy. These portrayals obscured the lived experience of those involved and shifted focus away from the system itself. Historical research reveals that these practices were not isolated incidents. They were structured, regulated, and deliberately implemented. This was policy, not deviation. It reflected a regime that viewed human beings as tools to be managed rather than individuals to be protected. The long silence surrounding these institutions was not accidental. Shame, fear, and social rejection ensured that many survivors never spoke publicly. When testimonies began to emerge decades later, they challenged comfortable distinctions between victim and bystander, between coercion and choice. This history demonstrates how exploitation can be normalized when embedded in routine. When harm is administered through procedures and justified as necessity, moral boundaries erode quietly. No dramatic rupture is required. Compliance becomes habit. The women who endured this system were not defined by what was done to them. But history often failed to make that distinction. They carried trauma and blame long after the regime that created their suffering collapsed. This chapter of history forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Totalitarian systems do not rely solely on fear or violence. They rely on organization, routine, and silence. By turning exploitation into policy and embedding it within bureaucracy, the Nazi regime demonstrated how easily cruelty can be disguised as necessity. When power defines what is acceptable, humanity becomes conditional. The stories that survived did so despite shame, not because of acknowledgement. They remind us that harm does not end when systems collapse. It lingers in memory, in stigma, and in unanswered questions. History often remembers leaders and battles. It must also remember the mechanisms, the quiet systems that operated out of sight and relied on obedience rather than applause. Because when injustice is administered calmly, recorded neatly, and discussed indirectly, it becomes far harder to see and even harder to stop.